Some nights don't feel like choices. They feel like destiny waiting to be noticed. The crystal chandeliers of the grand Regent ballroom shimmered like frozen stars, casting fractured light across polished marble floors as Zara Bennett stood at the edge of a world that had never been built for her, her deep brown skin glowing softly beneath the golden haze, while whispers floated through the air like invisible verdicts she had learned long ago not to answer. Her emerald dress, simple, elegant, chosen with care, moving gently with each breath as if reminding her that dignity did not need permission to exist. And yet every glance from the room carried the same silent question. What is she doing here? Her fingers tightening slightly around the invitation that had arrived by mistake, but felt too deliberate to ignore. Her mother's voice echoing somewhere deep within her memory, saying that sometimes the wrong door was the only way to find the right life. And still, standing there among tailored tuxedos and diamond-laced laughter, Zara understood the weight of being unseen. In a room full of people who believed they saw everything, until the moment the doors opened again, not loudly but with a presence that shifted the air itself, conversations thinning into quiet curiosity as Alexander Pierce stepped inside, his tailored charcoal suit catching the light like armor forged from success, his posture effortless yet commanding as though the entire room had been designed to follow his lead. And yet it wasn't the power in his stride that changed the rhythm of the night. It was the way his gaze paused, just briefly, just enough, when it found her, as if something unspoken had reached across the distance between them and refused to be ignored. Zara felt it before she understood it. That strange stillness when the world seems to hold its breath, her pulse steady but aware, not startled, not intimidated, simply present in a way that felt unfamiliar even to herself. As he moved through the crowd with quiet precision, nodding at investors, acknowledging executives, but never quite losing that invisible thread that kept drawing him back to her, until finally he stood close enough for the details to sharpen, the faint scent of cedar and winter air, the calm intensity in his eyes, the kind of composure that came from building empires and never apologizing for it. "You don't look like you belong to this room," he said, his voice low, not unkind, but observant in a way that felt almost disarming. And Zara tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Maybe the room doesn't know how to recognize who belongs," she replied, her voice steady, controlled, carrying no need to impress and no fear of being misunderstood. And something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as if the rules that governed everything around them had quietly stepped aside. Alexander studied her then. Not her dress, not her place in the hierarchy, but her, the quiet strength beneath the surface, the refusal to shrink, the presence that did not ask for validation. And for the first time that evening, the billionaire who owned half the skyline felt something he couldn't quantify, couldn't negotiate, couldn't control. And in that suspended moment between strangers, beneath the glow of 1,000 lights, destiny did not announce itself loudly. It simply waited, patient and certain, knowing that by morning, nothing would be the same. The music softened into something slower, almost deliberate, as if the night itself had begun to lean closer to whatever was unfolding between them. And Alexander gestured toward the terrace with a quiet confidence that did not require permission, while Zara hesitated for only a fraction of a second before following, her heels brushing softly against the marble as the air shifted from warm gold to cool midnight. The city stretching out beyond the glass like a living constellation, every building lit with stories she had never been invited into. Yet somehow tonight, she did not feel like an outsider looking in. She felt like someone standing at the edge of a decision she did not yet understand. Alexander rested his hands lightly on the railing, his posture relaxed but never careless. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence not empty, but filled with something steady and unspoken. "You are not impressed," he said finally, his tone more curious than offended. And Zara let out a quiet breath, her eyes tracing the skyline before returning to him. "I have seen buildings before," she replied, her voice calm, "but I am more interested in what people build inside themselves." And something in that answer lingered longer than expected, as if it had slipped past the layers Alexander had spent years constructing. He studied her again, more carefully this time, not as a curiosity, but as a presence he could not categorize. Most people here would have answered differently, he admitted, and Zara gave a small, almost amused smile. Most people here belong to this world, she said, and then after a brief pause added, I am still deciding if I want to. The city lights reflected in her eyes as she spoke, steady, unafraid, and for the first time that evening Alexander found himself without a prepared response. Something about her refusal to perform, to impress, to seek approval unsettled the balance he was used to, controlling, and instead of filling the space, he let it remain. Why did you come tonight? He asked after a moment, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, and Zara glanced down briefly at the invitation still in her hand before looking back at him. Because sometimes the wrong invitation leads you to the right moment, she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any rehearsed answer could have. The wind moved gently across the terrace, lifting a strand of her hair as the sounds of the ballroom faded into the background, leaving only the quiet rhythm of two people who had not expected to meet. Alexander shifted slightly closer, not intruding but present. And what if this moment changes something? He asked, his voice lower now, more measured, and Zara held his gaze, steady as ever. Then it will change something, she answered, without hesitation, without fear. And the honesty of it landed with a quiet certainty that neither of them could ignore. Time seemed to move differently after that. Conversations that were not planned but unfolded naturally. They spoke about work but not titles, about ambition but not status, about childhood memories that shaped the people they had become, and with each passing minute the distance between their worlds felt less like a barrier and more like a question waiting to be answered. Alexander found himself listening in a way he had not done in years, not calculating, not analyzing, simply present, while Zara allowed herself to exist in the moment without anticipating the outcome, knowing only that whatever this was, it was real in a way that did not need explanation, and somewhere beneath the quiet exchange of words and glances, beneath the polished surface of a night designed for appearances, something deeper began to take shape, something neither of them named, but both of them felt, like the first step into a story that had already begun long before either of them realized it. The night did not end with a decision. It unfolded into something quieter, something unspoken, as if both of them understood that whatever existed between them did not need to be defined to be real. The ballroom slowly emptied behind them while the city remained wide awake, and at some point Alexander offered to have his driver take her home, but Zara declined with a calm smile, not out of pride but out of habit, because she had always been the one to find her own way, yet when he insisted, not forcefully but with a kind of steady respect, she allowed it, and the car ride carried a silence that felt different from the one on the terrace, softer, less guarded, their reflections faint in the tinted glass as the city lights passed in long, golden streaks. You still have not told me what you do, he said after a while, his tone thoughtful rather than probing, and Zara looked out at the passing streets before answering. I help people who do not always get seen, she said simply, and though she did not elaborate, something in the way she said it carried enough truth to leave him without further questions. When the car finally stopped in front of a modest building far removed from the world he occupied, the contrast was undeniable. But Zara stepped out with the same quiet confidence she had carried all evening, as if value was not defined by where you arrived, but by how you stood when you did. Alexander followed, not out of obligation, but because something in him resisted ending the night too abruptly. The street was quiet, the air cooler now, and for a brief moment they stood facing each other without the distractions of chandeliers or city skylines, just two people in a space that asked nothing of them. Tonight was unexpected, he said, and it was not a statement he often made. Zara nodded slightly, her expression thoughtful. Some things are not meant to be planned, she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice, only a quiet acceptance of what had happened. He studied her one last time, as if committing something to memory he could not yet name, and then, without overcomplicating the moment, he reached into his pocket and offered her his card. Clean, simple, nothing more than a name and a number that carried the weight of everything he represented. Zara looked at it for a second before taking it, not because she needed it, but because refusing it would have been a denial of the moment itself. In case you decide the world you are still thinking about might be worth exploring, he said, and there was something almost vulnerable beneath the calm precision of his words. Zara held the card lightly between her fingers, then met his gaze with the same steady clarity that had unsettled him from the beginning. "Or in case you realize there is a world outside of yours," she replied. And for a fraction of a second, something in his expression shifted, not weakened, but opened. Just enough to reveal that beneath the control and certainty, there was still something human that had not been completely sealed away. Time stretched again, neither of them rushing to leave, neither of them forcing what came next, until finally Zara stepped back, not retreating but concluding. "Good night, Alexander," she said, her voice calm, final without being distant. And as she turned and walked toward the entrance of her building, the soft echo of her steps seemed to carry more weight than any grand farewell. Alexander remained where he was for a moment longer, watching the door close behind her, the quiet street settling back into its usual rhythm. And though he had spent years building a life defined by control and precision, there was something about that night, about her, that refused to fit into any structure he understood, something that did not demand his attention but held it anyway. And as he finally returned to the car, one thought lingered with a clarity he could not ignore. Some moments were not meant to be repeated, they were meant to be remembered, and he did not yet realize that this was not an ending. It was the beginning of something that would follow him long after the night itself had faded. The morning arrived without ceremony, pale sunlight slipping through the narrow window of Zara's apartment as if it had no intention of disturbing the quiet resolve that had already settled within her. She stood by the small kitchen counter with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, not searching for answers but acknowledging the shift she could not ignore. The night before lingered not as a fantasy, but as something precise, something that had touched a part of her she had long learned to guard. Yet she did not reach for her phone, did not study the card Alexander had given her. Instead, she placed it carefully inside a drawer, not discarded, not embraced, simply set aside like a question she refused to rush into answering. Across the city, in a space defined by glass walls and measured decisions, Alexander stood in his office overlooking a skyline he had spent years conquering, his schedule already filled with meetings, acquisitions, numbers that demanded clarity and control, and yet his attention drifted in ways that unsettled him. The memory of Zara's voice, steady and unafraid, threading through thoughts that were usually reserved for strategy and precision. He turned the card holder on his desk slowly between his fingers, the absence of her name there more present than any name that was. "You have a board call in 10 minutes. His assistant reminded him through the intercom, and he responded with the same composed tone he always used, but something beneath it was different, something less certain. The day moved forward as expected, contracts reviewed, decisions made, power exercised. Without hesitation, but none of it held the same sharp clarity it once had, as if something intangible had quietly shifted the lens through which he viewed everything. Hours later, when the city began to dim into evening again, he found himself standing at the same window, the skyline unchanged yet somehow unfamiliar. And for the first time in years, he did something he did not plan. He reached for his phone, paused, then set it back down, control returning just enough to remind him of the life he had built, a life that did not leave space for uncertainty. Days passed, measured and efficient, but the memory did not fade. It settled, becoming part of the silence between decisions, until one evening, without fully explaining it even to himself, he picked up the card he had kept, his fingers tracing the edge as if confirming something real, and dialed the number he had memorized without trying. The phone rang once, twice, and then her voice answered, calm, grounded, unchanged. "Hello," she said, and for a moment Alexander did not speak, not because he did not know what to say, but because the sound of her voice brought back something he had almost convinced himself was temporary. "It is Alexander," he said finally, his tone measured but quieter than usual, and there was a brief pause on the other end, not surprised, not uncertain, simply aware. "I wondered when you would decide," Zara replied, her words carrying neither expectation nor distance, just a simple acknowledgement of timing, and something in that response removed the need for pretense. They did not speak for long, no promises, no plans, only a decision made without being declared, to meet again, not because it was convenient, not because it made sense, but because something unfinished had quietly insisted on being explored. When the call ended, Zara stood still for a moment, the phone resting lightly in her hand, her gaze steady. She did not smile, did not question, she simply accepted what was unfolding. With the same quiet strength she carried into every unknown, and across the city, Alexander placed his phone down with a precision that felt different from all the decisions he had made before, because this time, for the first time in a long while, he was not controlling the outcome. He was stepping into it, unaware that the choice he had just made would not only change his life, but create a future neither of them could yet see. The next meeting did not happen by accident. It unfolded with a quiet inevitability, as if both of them had stepped into a rhythm neither had planned but neither resisted. Zara arrived first this time, choosing a small cafe tucked between two brownstone buildings where the scent of fresh coffee and warm bread replaced the distant hum of luxury. She sat by the window, her posture relaxed yet grounded, the kind of presence that did not shift to match its surroundings but allowed the surroundings to adjust around it. When Alexander entered, the contrast between him and the space was unmistakable, his tailored suit and precise movements standing out against the casual simplicity of the room. Yet he did not hesitate. He walked toward her with the same quiet focus he had carried from the very beginning. And when he sat across from her, there was no need for introductions, no need to revisit the night that had brought them here, only the understanding that something had already begun. "This is not my usual place," he admitted, glancing briefly around before returning his attention to her, and Zara gave a small nod. "That is exactly why I chose it," she replied, her voice steady, and something about that answer settled the space between them, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to step outside what was familiar. Their conversation moved differently this time, less guarded, less defined by the edges of their worlds. Alexander spoke about his work, not in terms of power or scale, but in moments, in decisions that shaped more than just numbers, and Zara listened without interruption, not impressed, not intimidated, simply present. And when she spoke, she did not try to match his language. She spoke of people, of stories, of lives that did not fit into boardrooms but carried weight just the same. And for the first time, Alexander found himself listening not to respond, but to understand. Hours passed without either of them noticing, the world outside continuing its steady pace while inside that small cafe, something quieter and more deliberate took shape. When they finally stood to leave, there was no rush, no need to define what came next, only a shared awareness that this connection was no longer accidental. It was a choice. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern continued. Meetings that were not scheduled but happened, conversations that did not demand outcomes. And somewhere within that space, something deeper began to grow, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that neither of them named. Until the evening when everything shifted, it was not a grand moment, not marked by celebration or conflict, but by something far more subtle. Zara stood by her window, the city lights reflecting softly against the glass, her hand resting lightly against her abdomen, her breath steady but thoughtful. The realization had come quietly, confirmed not by panic but by clarity, and for a long moment she did not move. She simply stood there, absorbing the weight of what it meant. Across the city, Alexander was reviewing a contract, his attention sharp, his decisions precise, unaware that the path he had stepped into was about to change in a way he could not control. Zara finally closed her eyes briefly, not in fear, not in uncertainty, but in acceptance, because she understood something he did not, that some moments were not about choice anymore. They were about responsibility, and as she opened her eyes again, her expression did not waver, it did not break, it settled into something stronger, something defined not by what she had lost or gained, but by what she was now carrying forward, alone if necessary, without hesitation, without apology, because she had never needed permission to stand in her truth, and she would not start now. The days that followed did not rush forward. They settled into a quiet tension that only one of them could feel. Zara moved through her life with the same steady rhythm she had always carried, waking early, walking the familiar streets, showing up for the people who depended on her with a calm strength that never wavered. But beneath that calm, something had shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that grew stronger each morning she opened her eyes. She had made her decision, not out of fear, not out of pressure, but out of a clarity that came from knowing exactly who she was. She would keep the child. She would carry this new life forward without hesitation, without waiting for permission, because she understood something that could not be negotiated. Responsibility did not ask for convenience. It asked for courage, and she had always chosen courage. Across the city, Alexander continued moving through a world defined by precision and expectation. Meetings stacked one after another, conversations measured in outcomes and results, his presence commanding, his decisions final. Yet even within that structure, something had begun to feel slightly misaligned, not enough to disrupt his routine, but enough to remind him that not everything could be controlled. He thought of Zara more often than he admitted, in brief moments between calls, in the silence after long days, in the rare pauses where his mind was not occupied with strategy, and still, he did not reach out, not because he did not want to, but because he had built a life where uncertainty was something to be managed, not followed, until the evening when Zara asked to see him. Her message simple, direct, without explanation, and something in the tone left no room for delay. They met in his office, a space that reflected everything he represented. Glass walls, sharp lines, a view that overlooked the city as if it belonged to him. Zara stood near the window when he entered, her reflection blending with the skyline, her posture calm, composed, unchanged. "You said this place shows what people build," she said quietly, without turning. "It does," he replied, stepping closer, his tone steady. "And what do you see?" she asked, finally facing him, and for a brief moment, Alexander hesitated, not because he did not have an answer, but because something in her expression told him this was not a question about buildings or power. "I see control," he said, choosing his words carefully, and Zara nodded slightly, accepting the answer without challenge. "Then you should understand what I am about to say," she continued, her voice calm, unwavering. And in that moment, the air shifted, not dramatically, but with a weight that neither of them could ignore. "I am pregnant," she said, the words landing without force, without emotion, simply as truth. Silence followed, not empty, but dense. Alexander did not react immediately, his expression still, controlled, but something beneath it tightened, calculations forming, possibilities aligning, responsibility measuring itself against the life he had built. "Are you certain?" he asked finally, not dismissive, but precise. Zara held his gaze without flinching. "Yes," she replied, and there was no hesitation, no doubt, just clarity. Another silence settled between them, longer this time, heavier. Alexander turned slightly, his eyes moving briefly toward the skyline before returning to her. And when he spoke again, his voice was calm, but colder, more defined. "This changes things," he said, and Zara studied him for a moment, not surprised, not hurt, simply aware. "It changes everything," she answered, and for a second, something almost human flickered across his expression, something uncertain, something not yet resolved, but it did not stay. Control returned, steady and firm. "I cannot have this become a complication," he said, his tone measured, deliberate, as if outlining terms in a contract. And that was the moment the distance between them became real, not physical, but undeniable. Zara did not step back, did not raise her voice, did not argue. She simply stood there, absorbing the truth of who he was when faced with something he could not control. "It is not a complication," she said quietly. "It is a life." And the difference between those two statements lingered in the space between them, sharp and irreversible. Alexander remained still, his silence now an answer in itself. And Zara nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding, because she had seen this before, not in him, but in the world. The moment where power chose itself over responsibility. She turned then, not waiting for anything more, not asking for a decision he had already made without saying it. And as she walked toward the door, her steps steady, her posture unbroken, one truth settled with absolute clarity. She had entered his world by accident, but she was leaving it by choice, carrying something far more powerful than anything he could offer. And this time, she did not look back. Time did not slow down for pain. It moved forward with quiet indifference, carrying Zara away from that glass-walled office and into a life that demanded more than reflection. The city remained the same, the streets unchanged, but her world had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And yet she did not break. She did not retreat. She rebuilt, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a discipline that turned each day into a step forward. Months passed, her body changing in ways that reminded her constantly of the life she had chosen to protect. And still she worked, still she showed up, her hands steady, her voice calm, her presence unwavering, because she understood something deeper than fear, that strength was not about never falling. It was about standing even when no one was there to catch you. There were nights when the silence felt heavier, when the absence of what could have been pressed against her thoughts. But she never allowed it to define her. She moved through it, past it, beyond it, until the day her son was born, not with noise or chaos, but with a quiet intensity that filled the room with something sacred. She held him for the first time, his small fingers curling instinctively around hers, his eyes closed as if the world could wait just a little longer. And in that moment, everything became clear, not the past, not the choices, but the purpose. She named him Micah, a name that carried strength without needing explanation. Years unfolded with a rhythm that belonged only to them. Mornings filled with small routines, laughter that came easily, questions that grew deeper as he did. Micah was observant, thoughtful, carrying a quiet confidence that mirrored something Zara recognized but never spoke of. He did not ask about a father, not at first, because his world was full in the way that mattered, shaped by presence, by consistency, by love that did not need to announce itself to be felt. Zara built more than a life. She built a foundation, expanding her work into a network of community clinics that served those who had long been overlooked, her name becoming known not in headlines, but in gratitude, in lives changed quietly, steadily, with purpose. And through it all, she never reached back, never questioned the decision she had made, because every day confirmed what she had already known, that some choices were not about what you lost, but about what you chose to carry forward across the city. In a world that measured success in numbers and influence, Alexander Pierce continued to rise, his empire expanding, his name carrying weight in rooms where decisions shaped entire industries. He remained composed, controlled, respected, and yet something within that structure remained untouched, a space that no achievement filled. He rarely thought of Zara directly, not in words, not in memories he allowed to surface fully, but in moments, brief and uninvited, when something familiar passed through his thoughts without explanation, and he dismissed it each time, returning to the certainty he understood, until the day everything shifted. It began with something small, a meeting scheduled at one of the community clinics his foundation had agreed to support, a routine visit, a calculated investment in public image and social responsibility. He arrived with the same composed presence, his steps measured, his attention already divided between obligation and efficiency. But the moment he stepped inside, something unfamiliar settled in the air, not visible, not defined, but present. Children's voices echoed softly through the halls, the scent of antiseptic mixed with something warmer, something human. And as he moved through the space, acknowledging staff, observing operations, his gaze paused, just briefly, on a boy standing near the reception desk. The child could not have been more than 6 years old, his posture straight, his expression calm, his eyes lifted in quiet observation. And something about those eyes, something precise, something unmistakable, caused Alexander to stop, not physically, but internally, as if a part of him had recognized something before his mind could catch up. The boy looked at him without hesitation, without awe, simply present. And in that silent exchange, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, a feeling Alexander could not explain, could not categorize. And for the first time in years, control did not come immediately. It hesitated, just long enough for something deeper to begin unfolding. The moment did not announce itself with certainty. It unfolded slowly, like a question that refused to be ignored. Alexander remained still for a fraction longer than necessary, his gaze fixed on the boy as the noise of the clinic continued around them. Staff moving, children laughing, life happening in quiet, ordinary ways, yet none of it reached him the same way. Because something in that child's presence had disrupted a balance he had spent years perfecting, the boy did not look away, did not shrink under the weight of his attention. He simply stood there, composed in a way that felt unfamiliar for someone so young. And then, without hesitation, he spoke. "You are not from here." The words were not accusatory, not curious in the way children often are. They were observational, precise, and Alexander felt something shift again, deeper this time. "No," he replied, his voice steady, though quieter than usual. "I am visiting." The boy nodded once, as if confirming something he had already understood, and there was a pause, not awkward, not forced, just present, until a nurse called out from down the hall, "Micah, your mother is looking for you." And the name landed with a weight Alexander did not immediately recognize, but it stayed, lingering in the back of his thoughts as the boy turned, offering one last look that held no attachment, no expectation, only a calm awareness. Before walking away with the same quiet confidence he had carried from the beginning, Alexander continued through the clinic, completing the visit as expected, shaking hands, acknowledging progress, discussing funding, every movement precise, every word measured. Yet something beneath it all had shifted, not enough to disrupt the structure, but enough to create a space he could not ignore. Later, as he prepared to leave, he found himself asking, almost casually, the boy at the reception desk, "Micah, how long has he been coming here?" The director glanced up with a small smile. "He does not come here. He belongs here," she replied. And when Alexander raised a slight brow, she continued, "His mother founded this clinic. Actually, she built all of them, started with nothing, just a small space and a vision. Now she runs an entire network across the city." Alexander felt the words settle. Slowly, deliberately, each one connecting to something just beyond reach. "And his mother's name?" he asked, his tone unchanged, though something within it had tightened. The director's smile widened slightly, unaware of the shift taking place before her. "Zara Bennett," she said, simply, as if the name required no explanation, and in that moment, the world did not stop. It did not collapse. It aligned. Every unanswered question, every quiet memory, every unspoken connection moving into place. With a clarity that left no room for doubt, Alexander did not react outwardly. His expression remained composed, controlled, but something beneath that control fractured, not visibly, not dramatically, but with a precision that cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced. He nodded once, thanked the director, and turned toward the exit, each step measured, each breath steady, as if maintaining control was the only thing keeping everything else from shifting completely. Outside, the city moved as it always had, indifferent to the revelations unfolding within him. Cars passing, people walking, life continuing without pause. But Alexander did not move immediately. He stood there, the weight of the truth settling in a way that could not be dismissed, could not be negotiated, could not be undone. 6 years, he calculated it without meaning to. The timeline aligning with a precision that left no space for denial. The boy's eyes, the posture, the quiet confidence. It was not resemblance that struck him. It was recognition, something deeper than appearance, something that connected without permission. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Pierce found himself facing something he could not control, not a business deal, not a market shift, but a truth, simple and undeniable, that did not ask for his approval to exist. And as he finally exhaled, slow and deliberate, one realization settled with absolute clarity. The life he had once dismissed as a complication had grown into something far beyond his reach. And now, standing outside the world she had built without him, he understood something he had never allowed himself to consider before. He had not just walked away from a moment. He had walked away from a future that was now standing right in front of him, looking back with eyes that already knew more than he ever intended to reveal. He did not go back immediately, because some truths do not ask to be rushed, they demand to be understood, and Alexander Pierce had spent his entire life moving forward without looking back. But now every step forward felt incomplete, as if something behind him had finally found a way to matter. The city blurred around him that evening, not because it had changed, but because his focus had. the glass towers, the boardrooms. The carefully constructed life that once defined him now stood in contrast to something far simpler and far more real. A boy with steady eyes and a woman who had built an entire world without ever asking him to be part of it. Days passed before he returned, not out of hesitation, but out of the need to approach something he could not control with a clarity he had never needed before. When he stepped into the clinic again, the space felt different, not unfamiliar, but more defined, as if he was no longer an observer, but someone standing at the edge of a truth he could not ignore. He found her in one of the consultation rooms, her back to him, speaking gently to a patient, her voice calm, measured, carrying the same quiet strength he remembered. And for a moment, he did not interrupt. He simply stood there, taking in the life she had built, the presence she carried, the way everything around her seemed to move with purpose rather than power. When she finally turned and saw him, there was no shock, no hesitation, only recognition, as if she had always known this moment would come. "You found your way back," she said, her tone even, not welcoming, not rejecting, just stating what was. Alexander nodded once, stepping closer but not too close, aware that distance now held meaning. "I met him," he said, and there was no need to say the name, because it already existed between them. Zara held his gaze for a moment, her expression unchanged. "He is not a secret," she replied quietly, and the words carried no accusation, only truth. Alexander exhaled slowly, the weight of everything settling in a way he could not deflect. "I did not know," he said, and for the first time, his voice held something unguarded, not weakness, but acknowledgement. Zara studied him briefly, not searching for regret, not measuring his words, simply seeing him as he was. "You chose not to know," she said, her voice calm, precise, and the difference between those two statements landed with a clarity that could not be argued. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but necessary, because some truths needed space to exist fully. "What do you want?" she asked after a moment. Not confrontational, not emotional, just direct, and Alexander did not answer immediately, because for the first time in his life, the answer was not something he could calculate. It was something he had to understand. "I do not know yet," he admitted, and the honesty of it remained in the air longer than any prepared response could have. Zara nodded once, accepting the answer without reaction, because she had never needed him to define her life, and she would not start now. "Then do not rush to define his," she said, her voice soft but firm. And in that moment, the conversation shifted, not toward reconciliation, not toward resolution, but toward something more real, responsibility without expectation, presence without entitlement. Alexander absorbed her words, not as a challenge, but as a boundary he could not ignore. And for the first time, he understood that this was not about reclaiming something he had lost. It was about earning something he had never had. He turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the hallway where he knew the boy would be. The boy who carried his blood but not his name, his presence but not his history. And for a brief moment, something within him softened, not enough to erase the past, but enough to recognize the future. When he looked back at Zara, there was no request in his expression, no demand, only a quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be given. It would have to be built, slowly, carefully, without assumption. And as he stepped back, allowing space where once he would have taken control, one truth settled with a clarity he could not ignore. Some men are given everything and still lose what matters, and others learn too late that the only things worth having are the ones you must become worthy of. And this time, for the first time, Alexander Pierce was not trying to win. He was trying to understand what it meant to deserve.